For All the Jural Assemblies Part 27 International Jurisdiction by Anna von Reitz. One of the most important things to remember is that in America and for purpose of the American government, the word interstate is completely synonymous with the word international. This is because each state is in fact its own country and its own nation. For the sake of streamlining certain functions and creating uniformity in some areas to bulwark our strength, such as military operations and expenses, and to expedite free trade, such as interstate banking services, our states have agreed to act together as members of an unincorporated federation of states known as the United States of America. But each and every power that this holding company has or can delegate derives from the member states and powers which they intrinsically possess. And the member states remain sovereign. As we saw, the national soil jurisdiction is controlled by unincorporated republican states which are members of the United States. The international jurisdiction is controlled by unincorporated states which are members of the United States of America, a federation of states. The international jurisdiction controlled by your state has three components: air, land, and sea. We have discussed the international land jurisdiction of the states briefly and described it generally as the thick layer of rock and material underlying the top 6 inches of soil. Land obviously includes your state's mineral and groundwater resources. The international land jurisdiction of your state is also able to appear in some contexts above the soil, as it does when we build railroads and post roads and post offices and interstate highways and interstate electrical services. These are transit lanes and service stations on land analogous to sea lanes and docks in the jurisdiction of the sea, resulting in routes and infrastructure that have been created to deliver interstate, international or global services within your state. Because this interstate, international infrastructure is within the borders of your state, such facilities remain under state control, but because of their international nature and their role as part of the connecting service web other states depend on, they fall under your state's international land jurisdiction and function under international law. Both the railroads and the post offices have been used to promote various inroads against local law and control. Many states have allowed these foreign international entities to exercise the right of eminent domain, for example, which allows them to condemn public and private property, essentially commandeering it to allow construction of infrastructure. Thus, these enterprises have been allowed to abuse both public and private property owners for their own benefit, using the excuse that the public good they provide outweighs the loss to others' property rights. Similar arguments have been advanced with less success to excuse the imposition of property taxes on landowners within each state to pay for public services, such as snow removal on public roads. This places a disproportionate and arbitrary burden on the landlords that is non-consensual and is in fact an unlawful conversion of property rights. The territorial state of state that is functioning in a caretaking capacity and mandating these practices in our states of the Union has no actual authority to impose upon the states and people in this way, and instead of presuming upon the landlords should be paying back dividends and lease fees and compensating the states and people for the use of their resources. An examination of the comprehensive annual financial reports of each territorial and municipal state-of-state organization reveals that the income these organizations receive from the use of our state resources each year is far in excess of all expenses, and that largesse should, logically, be available to pay for public services such as snow removal and fire departments without any additional taxation. However, without active and competent input from the state Jural Assemblies, the for-hire state of state employees and their corporate legislatures have padded their own pension plans instead. The checks and balances system has been totally out of whack in this country because the state Jural Assemblies have not been meeting regularly, have not weighed in on the deployment of state income, have not protected private property rights, have not insisted on the enforcement of the public law, and haven't been doing their job representing the interests of the actual state and people. Also, because these interstate, international businesses are operating in international jurisdiction but are interfacing directly with our state soil jurisdiction, there are conflicts of law that result. The most visible part of this conflict of law arises from the fact that these private and international business organizations functioning under international law have been allowed to employ Pinkertons, private law enforcement agencies, within the boundaries of each state, and these LEO organizations have proliferated and been hired as subcontractors in other venues to substitute for actual peacekeeping officials and officers. Law enforcement officers are, generally speaking, 1. Not familiar with the public law, having been trained to enforce the code and statutory law of the international jurisdiction instead, and 2. Are not properly directed to enforce the public law even when they are hired to do so. These private security agencies have become abusive and have failed to recognize the fact that the people of the state are living under the public law and, except when they are actually on a train, in a post office, or otherwise in direct contact with these limited international land jurisdiction functions, railroads, electrical power line right-of-ways, post offices, etc., the living people of each state are not subject to international law within the boundaries of their states. Territorial state-of-state employees and municipal state-of-state employees are subject to international law, but the states and people are not, until and unless we directly interface with a railroad, post office, or other interstate, international utility. For example, we rob a post office, vandalize a power pole, or commit murder on a railroad right-of-way. The territorial and municipal organizations in each state have discovered that they can make money by arresting people and filling up prison facilities, which has led to the proliferation of more and more oppressive statutory laws and burgeoning prison populations. This prisons for profit scheme is a direct affront to our sovereignty, in which people of each state are deliberately mischaracterized as territorial or municipal persons, held to be subject to territorial and/or municipal international law, and incarcerated at our expense. This is not only an abuse of our people, it is an abuse of our purses by our employees. They are profiting themselves by arresting us under color of law, charging us under statutory laws we are not naturally obligated to obey, and then charging our states for the service of putting us in jail. More abuses include registration and copyrighting of our private given names as property belonging to state-of-state and/or municipal state-of-state organizations, conferring of federal citizenship obligations via unconscionable contracts, seizure, manipulation, and patenting of our unique DNA. Securitization of living people as assets belonging to these organizations, and the bonding of public and private property belonging to our states and people for the debts of these state-of-state organizations. These are actions readily recognizable as crimes that have been going on in our country for decades via the abuse of our state's international jurisdiction. This has only been made possible because our trusting people have been deliberately kept unaware of the false claims being made against them by their employees, and our state Jural Assemblies have not assembled and kept watch on the proverbial store. The international sea jurisdiction belonging to each state varies according the individual state's location and geography. Thanks to the Great Lakes and abundant large navigable rivers, plus sea coasts on 3 sides of our country, most states have ample and direct access to the transport of goods and services via these natural conduits. Generally speaking, the British monarch is supposed to be acting as the trustee of all Americans and all American shipping on the high seas and navigable inland waterways, and as such, our states should not have a great deal to worry about. However, as more and more Americans have unwittingly allowed themselves to be mischaracterized as territorial or municipal citizens instead of retaining their birthright political status, the British monarchs have been encouraged to escape their duty owed to the states and people, and eager to profit themselves from the states of states and persons, instead. The Coast Guard owed to each seaboard state has been allowed to run amok and been privatized and misdirected, similar to what has gone on with the hired law enforcement officers being used to substitute for peacekeeping officials and officers of the law. As a result, the Coast Guard has become a clearinghouse for smuggling and theft from the states and people instead of a bulwark in our defense. Port authorities have similarly been employed in the interests of international crime and exportation of Americans, both literally and figuratively, along with our resources, using ports of entry and free trade zones established in virtually every state. The international airspace owed to each state has similarly been abused to favor international business interests and placed the profits of these commercial interests above any benefit owed to the states and people of this country. We are constantly bombarded with false advertising and propaganda from foreign sources clogging up our public airwaves, and no effort is being made to impose any better standards. Media monopolies have become common, and other monopolies have grown up uninhibited by the proper application of public interest antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation. Although these issues often bridge upon commerce rather than international trade, the state Jural Assemblies have a potent voice that needs to be heard in Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. What goes on in our states is fundamentally under the authority and control of the people of each state, so this is all hash that we need to settle with our employees and service providers and international trustees. In order to do our job, we have to choose to act in our birthright political capacity as one of the people of our State of the Union, and make public declaration of this fact by recording our deliberate and permanent expatriation from any presumed federal citizenship obligation. If we fulfill our obligations as state nationals and/or state citizens and/or state electors, we will have more than enough to do. The members of our state Jural Assemblies have the critical role and function of nullifying unconstitutional and repugnant laws, upholding and enforcing the public law including the constitutions, and controlling the soil, national, and land, international jurisdictions of our state. Beginning with the fact that we are not acting as federal persons and are not accepting any federal citizenship obligations, for all the reasons cited above and far more beyond the scope of this small discussion, our state Jural Assemblies must act to direct the proper administration of the international land jurisdiction we are heir to, and to bring effective complaints to our federal service providers and international trustees regarding the misuse and abuse of the international sea and air jurisdiction of our states. As brief as this discussion has been, the issues raised are compelling and should be enough to convince any American that effective action must be taken to restore the people and the states and the public law. Please hit subscribe, like, share, embed, and get ready for many more Anna von Reitz videos.